I am really, really excited about our speaker today. This is one of those moments when high academia and the Coinbase mission of an open financial system come into direct intersection. And so it really is my great pleasure to introduce my friend who I've collaborated with on lots of things over the years and who is a professor at my alma mater, the University of Chicago Law School, Todd Henderson. Todd, thanks for being here.
Thank you. It's awesome to be here.
So I want to tell you a few things about Todd before we get started and talk about his new book. Todd has many distinctions, one of which is he's the kind of lawyer that in a tech community you can really listen to. This is a guy who has an actual engineering degree from Princeton and understands a little something about technology, which is great. Todd graduated from law school at the University of Chicago just a few years after I did. While he was there, he was on the University of Chicago championship intramural football team, which is really saying something at a school that abolished its varsity football team in 1918, when the university was led by a president who was famous for saying that anytime he felt like exercising, he laid down until the feeling went away. Todd also was thrice voted at the University of Chicago Law School as the tallest law professor, so he's got a number of important distinctions here. The reason Todd's with us today is because he's just published a new book, which I had the privilege of reading in its galley proofs form just a couple of months ago, called The Trust Revolution. In the book, Todd talks about a number of areas where societal trust has broken down and technology has stepped into the breach. And some of those areas include crypto. But they also include other areas like Uber hailing apps as opposed to taxi cabs and the breakdown of trust in all kinds of other areas of the economy. And so I thought it would make a lot of sense for Todd to come in and talk about the level of optimism or pessimism that he has about the ability of technologies like blockchain and crypto to solve for trust problems, to talk about the way that trust problems in finance are similar to trust problems elsewhere in the economy, and a lot of other interesting things. So I guess I just wanted to start here, just to jump right in, Todd, by asking you, why'd you write the book, and why now? Why is now the moment for a trust revolution?
Thanks, Brian, and thanks everybody for coming. So I was participating in an event about Uber. Chicago was thinking about regulating Uber, sort of regulating out of existence, as California is now trying to do, or maybe trying to do. And so this was a hot topic in Chicago. I was invited to be on a panel, and I got a question from somebody who asked me, isn't it unfair that Uber is competing with taxi cabs on an unlevel playing field? Good question. And my answer was, Uber's not competing with taxi cabs. And the guy sort of said, well, who are they competing with? And I said, their competitor's government. And he sort of looked askance, and I said, yeah, both of them are competing to provide a mechanism by which you can trust a ride with a stranger. Your mom told you when you were little, if she was like my mom, don't ride with strangers, and that's good advice. It's probably kept you out of a lot of mischief. But when I fly here to San Francisco this morning, I need to ride with a stranger. And government provided that mechanism in the early part of the 20th century in a nice regulated package, a yellow car, a label on top, screening of drivers and all kinds of licensures, a bond in the form of a medallion. And then Uber came along and said, we have a better mechanism for you to trust strangers, a lot less costly, a lot more efficient, and that's this internet platform. And we don't really trust Uber so much as an intermediary. We're trusting our fellow humans who have ridden with this particular driver. Uber just enables us to trust our fellow man. So that was the kind of genesis of the book. And I can talk more about Uber, but the peculiarity of that story is that in the 1980s, the Reagan-Thatcher deregulation movement swept the world, and 30 cities in the United States deregulated their cab businesses. And all of them had re-regulated them by the 1990s. And the reason was there was no technology available to create an efficient market for trust. You can't have competing cabs pull up to you on the street. You're not a repeat player. There's economic problems about costs and average costs and all sorts of things that I could get into but would bore you to tears. But the point was there was no technology that enabled trust to be delivered in a better way. So deregulation just, and I'm for deregulation, but without technology, deregulation is an empty promise. And what was great about the Uber experience is it showed how this mix of technology and deregulation could really transform an entire industry. especially when the government was in and had a monopoly on. So that's why.
So, what's really interesting about that, Todd, is we talk a lot at Coinbase about intermediaries. In our world, we think a lot about the role that banks and securities brokers play as intermediaries in finance. And so every transaction's got to go through some big central hub. And when I hear you talk about the taxi industry, of course, the taxi commission in any given city is the intermediary. They're the one that are providing validation that this is a safe stranger to ride with. Uber maybe solves for that. But of course, occasionally you read about the story of somebody who gets beaten up or killed even in the back of an Uber car. And so it's not perfect. And every time you hear about that, there's sort of backlash on that. And so the other thing everybody talks about in Silicon Valley these days is the tech lash, right? So you've had all these internet platforms arise, the Facebooks and Googles of the world, who are trying to allow us to do things peer-to-peer. And yet it seems like trust in the peer-to-peer platforms is at a low ebb at the moment. What's your level of optimism or pessimism about the ability of technology platforms to actually sustain that role?
So I'm an Uber optimist.
That's a laugh line in Chicago. Sorry to say that.
But let me say if you're a pessimist, where that pessimism could come from. So, and I go through this in the book, and I don't want to summarize the book here because I would bore you. And plus, I hope you buy it. And if you do want a copy, I can get you one at cost and signed and bells and whistles. Just talk to your maitre d'. The history of trust and the battle between businesses providing trust and governments providing trust and other organizations like religions and families providing trust is one of competition. I call this a market for trust in the book. The weird thing about trust is the government is both the primary provider of trust. The reason you sleep at night and don't worry that you're going to be killed, the reason that you can invest in long-term projects and sign contracts with people is in large part because the government stands with courts and cops and all sorts of violence ready to defend you, so you can trust those situations. So government's a huge provider of trust. The weird thing is also a regulator of the other people who would offer trust in the same way or in competition with the government. So the government provides trust in the rideshare market through the taxi commission. It also regulates Uber. And so the government can, like the government in California has done, or governments in other countries have done. In France, in Paris, you can't get Uber because the taxi drivers have captured the government and the government's put Uber out of business. And that means there is the risk that government will prefer itself in the provision of trust. Uber's a success story, but the government has pushed back, and the people who have a vested interest in the status quo, in the ride-sharing industry, the taxi cabs, and the taxi cab commissioners, both of whom had a monopoly, life was good for them, those people will use the government to put their competitors out of business. And they'll use them with these horror stories like, oh, somebody was hurt. Well, of course, every system is imperfect, and you can't compare any system of regulation to nirvana. You have to compare it to the next best alternative. And on every dimension that I've seen, objective measures, the ride-hailing companies are better and improvement and such. So if you talk about finance, of course, the Federal Reserve and the politicians who benefit from it and the incumbent banks and all the intermediaries who have the status quo are going to resist. And they're going to tell horror stories, and they're going to use their surrogates in the media or in academia to go out and spread all kinds of parades of horror about the world falling apart. I think it's important to just put that in context. And I'll just give one historical example. And this comes from the medieval times in a place called Bruges in Belgium. There were guilds of merchants who arose to solve the problem of trust because we really didn't have corporations, we didn't have identifiable brands, and people selling and buying various kind of goods couldn't trust that the people who were selling or trading with them were going to cheat them. So guilds arose, and these guilds of merchants, like the New York Stock Exchange, provided a discipline, a private discipline over people who were part of their guild. You'd pay a membership to be a part of the guild. You were a baker or a weaver, and if you cheated, they would throw you out because that cheating cost all of them too. And so this kind of system of private regulation was incredibly successful and made Ghent and Bruges and Antwerp the centers of industrial production in Europe in the medieval times. And then some French princes showed up and they said, this is no good. These people are all getting uppity. They think they can get rid of the king. So let's put them out of business. And so, and I talk about this in the book, Prince comes along and does he say, you know what, I have a better system of creating trust. Here's what I'm going to do so that you can trust. Now, make your choice. No. He came and told horrible stories, picked anecdotes about things that didn't go exactly right, and spun conspiracy theories about how these guys were up to no good and put them all out of business. We're just seeing a replay, and there's many examples like this in the book.
So anybody see analogies there? So once upon a time, there was this thing called Silk Road, and so all of the good that crypto investment has done and all the platforms has created have to be stopped by the government, because we can think of one example one time where something bad happened. Right?
Yeah, and no one has ever in the history of the world, bought illicit drugs or slaves or weapons with cash. That's never happened.
Right.
No one's ever
exactly.
used no one's ever used a bank account to launder money or engage in all sorts of horrible practices. I mean, of course not. The banking system is perfect, and nothing bad ever happens.
Nothing. That's certainly my experience. I've never been associated with a bank where anything bad happened. At least I know that. So, so Todd, you don't tell me about the optimism versus pessimism question, though.
I'm optimistic because I think that technology, we're at the very, very earliest stages of what kind of technology and how it's going to unlock the ability of people to trust each other in new ways. The government just has to get out of the way. That's a big if. So I think that the message of this book is for people to be comfortable with change in the way that trust is delivered. There's been, and I go through this in the book, there have been cycles in, is the government doing more of it or less of it? The reason that I'm a little bit cautious is government has never been as big or powerful as it is today. And so that's a really big if. But if the government will just get out of the way, I'm quite optimistic that technologies that we can't even imagine, maybe some of you are thinking about in your, in the shower in the morning, that kind of stuff is going to unlock enormous potential. Because the really great thing about the trust that's involved in digital assets or in Uber and lots of other examples we talk about in the book is every other trust delivery mechanism that has strong intermediaries, it's very hard to scale that trust. As a corporation gets bigger, as the government gets bigger and bigger, the mistakes that it can make, the ability for it to be captured, the bureaucracy that makes it less efficient, that all slows down its ability to create more and more trust. What we call in the book the digital tribe, it's a return to personal trust, which is the best kind of trust. The problem with personal trust is it's very hard to scale. I only have a few friends that would drive me to the airport. I only have a few friends I would really trust to eat dinner at their house or engage in transactions. The digital tribe is an infinitely scalable version of trust, and that's what's so exciting about it. And I think we have to kind of push the technology as hard and fast as we can so that we can show the potential for how it can unlock this. We could talk about it forever. But trying to convince people of something by just talking to them is not really that effective. I could tell you about the virtues of a candy bar, and I could write books about it and sing songs about it and do a performance dance. And until you taste it, you're not going to know whether it's delicious or not. But once you've had that bite, you're like, oh, that's awesome. I don't want that to go away. And that's really what happened with Uber. It took a guy who's now been pilloried to be so bold as to say, you know what, San Francisco, try to shut me down. He was in, I love the story, he's in Korea. He's flying to Japan, or maybe it was the other way around. And they said, the general counsel said to him, you're going to be arrested when you land. And he's like, great, let him arrest me. That kind of thing where I'm going to give it to the people and then force the politicians to try to take it away. That's the kind of attitude that we need, and that I think will overcome the lift. So as long as we don't squelch that attitude, I'm quite optimistic.
Got it. So what you're really saying is the only thing more powerful than the government's monopoly on the levers of power is the demand side case. So if you can deploy this stuff broadly enough, the very voters that politicians depend on are going to require that the good be provided. So in other words, in crypto land, we've got to get this stuff deployed at scale before it can be killed.
Absolutely. If you ask for permission to put the Federal Reserve out of business, they're going to say no. You've got to
hold on. I just need to make it a quick note.
Yeah.
Just a second. See, out of business. Oh, okay. Sorry. Go ahead.
And by the way, Milton Friedman in the 1970s said, and I'm going to quote from memory, but so it won't be exactly right. I've always been in favor of abolishing the Federal Reserve and replacing it with a machine that would increase the money supply on a steady rate. And so this was theory, like the taxi cab deregulation in the 1980s. But there was no technology to enable it, and people couldn't imagine. In this country and every other country, government has not always had a monopoly on money. This is a very modern thing. In this country, prior to the Federal Reserve Act in the early part of the 20th century, there were banks all over the place that issued their own money. And if you went from your town to another town, you had paper money issued by your bank, Todd's Bank money. And that was fine if everybody lived in the area around that bank and everybody knew I could trust this money. But then once the railroads arrive and people are moving all over the place, now I'm traveling from Chicago where I've got my money in the Chicago bank, and I come to San Francisco, and it's like, I don't know this bank. Can I trust this money? Should I take this or not? And then the federal government comes along, just like the taxi commission, who wants you to trust strangers and says, aha, we have a way to massively increase the trust in the monetary system. We'll issue money, and it will be good everywhere. And that was a huge benefit to society because now more people could cooperate. More people could contract with each other. Human cooperation is what everything is about. What is the mechanism that enables the most human cooperation at the lowest possible cost? The problem with the government printing money, however, is they're the government. They're going to screw it up. It's going to be subjected to political forces. Donald Trump stomping his foot like a little, a baby who wants another chocolate bar, saying, you should lower rates because it's good for my reelection. And the government's going to overprint money like they did in the financial crisis, subsidizing houses and those huge problems. And moreover, the fact that the government provides a guarantee for banks means that banks will take too much risk. Duh. It makes the solution great because I can put my money in Bank of America and know that no matter what risk Bank of America takes, I will be made whole. But when the government does that, guess what? I don't pay any attention to the risk Bank of America is taking as a shareholder or a stakeholder in Bank of America. It'd be way better if my money was in a bank that I really cared about their risk taking. They would then take the appropriate level of risk, not excessive risks. And that takes competition, not a government guarantee. And again, it's the same story as taxi cabs. The idea of free banking and competition in the supply of money, that's a great idea, but without the technology you guys are working on in part, you can't have it because it's not scalable. There's no way of delivering the trust. When I was waiting for to come upstairs, I looked across the street, and there's two banks. There's the Boston Private Bank and Trust. See the name Trust in there. And there's the California Trust Bank. And both of them look like Greek temples. Is it that the architects of banks had a fondness for ancient Greece? Of course not. The reason banks were made out of big, huge white stone with big Doric columns is because they wanted to convey trust. And of course now, that's a complete waste because you don't trust it because it's big and stable and it's got those columns. You go on your phone and you make 2 clicks. You trust it for other reasons that have nothing to do with that. And that social investment we've made, the people who mined the quarries and delivered those things and made those columns, that was all just completely socially wasteful from our standpoint today because we have technology that enables them to trust them at lower costs.
See, I'm really learning something here because I always thought that the reason banks look like Greek temples is because there was something mythical going on in there.
Yeah, right.
But now you come to Todd, I want to unpack something you said because I think for this audience it's really important we pause on this for a second. So you mentioned free banking. You adverted to the idea that once upon a time there had been banks that were essentially printing their own currencies that were claims on those individual banks. We hear a lot in our industry, including from a lot of regulators and government officials, that an inherent aspect of national sovereignty is having a monopoly on printing money. That this is an inherent part, like having borders or having I don't know what other aspects there are, having a common law. But that's really not true, is it? I mean, it has not always been the case that countries printed their own money. Can you just give us a 2-minute history lesson on that?
Yeah, and definitely not the case. Like I said, this is a sort of new development. It was always the case throughout all of history that governments went to banks that were private entities to raise money for things like the stuff that governments do, like go to other countries and kill people. They needed money to do that, and they couldn't just get the money. They had to go to banks and borrow the money. So throughout history, it was private banks. I mean, it's the exact inverse of what we think of today. The King of England, when he went to borrow money to pay for wars in France, was not less sovereign because the banks were the people who were issuing currency. Currencies and monies, the system of exchange, has always existed at a kind of transnational level as a medium for just getting people to cooperate. The Medicis in Italy were bankers to all of Europe. They developed an enormously successful mechanism for trust that transcended governments because they didn't, if you were a merchant and you were buying something in France and moving it to Rome, there was no system or mechanism by which to do that system of payments. So the Medicis created their own private version of that. And this is a long history that is not just about money, but about all kinds of trade. There was this thing called the Hanseatic League, which existed in Europe, which provided a sort of private system of exchange throughout Europe. And sovereign countries were just laid on top of that. In fact, the first corporation, this is not exactly on the banking point, but it's a kind of interesting example. The first real corporation was this thing called the Company of Merchants of the Staple. It got its royal charter in 1319. These were English merchants in Antwerp, in Belgium. And they were wool merchants. They were selling British wool. The problem for them was there was no way to differentiate wool merchants, one from the other. And they were beyond the reach of any law. They were English citizens. They weren't really subject to the sovereign power of the Belgian king at the time. And the British king was too far away over in England. It would take months for the information about some misdeeds to even get to England. How could the British king regulate his citizens in Belgium? And so the merchants got together and they said, hey, here's a way we can do it. We'll create a corporation. It'll have a board of directors of 24 people. They will promulgate rules of behavior and punish misdeeds. And that's the way we can create the trust necessary away from where the king is. And that didn't implicate the sovereignty of the king in any way. He was extending the amount of trust that could be provided, but it was because it was further afield of where he was able through the exercise of his violence and sovereignty.
So that was basically the crypto rating council of the 14th century, you're saying?
Exactly.
Yeah, so this is an idea with ancient provenance, is what I'm hearing. So, I mean, I guess what I'm trying to figure out is why is this such a deeply embedded idea that money is a government creation, that only money issued by the government is safe, only money issued by the government is real? Where do you think that comes from?
It's in the government's interest to propagate this myth. I mean, first of all, it's our lived experience for the lives of everybody alive today. This is what we've had. And every time the government has made a mistake, and they've made huge mistakes that have caused more harm and displacement in the country than anything else, every time they've done that, they've blamed it on something else. Again, this is a typical, just deflect. The financial crisis was not, or the internet bubble where A Greenspan was bad on the spigot, or the financial crisis. That was greedy people who were making mistakes. It definitely wasn't our fault. So it's what we've had in sort of modern history. It's in the government's interest to promulgate this myth. And, there's examples all over the place. One of my favorite examples is the currency in federal prisons. Anybody have any idea what the currency in a federal prison is?
No. This is why you got to buy the book. This story right here.
You can't. Well, I should leave it to get people, but that's okay. I make like 20 cents on every book, so it really doesn't matter. Smoking's outlawed in federal prisons. So what do you need for currency? You need something that is not going to be consumed, right? Water's a really bad currency because I'm thirsty and I'm drinking it. It just goes away. I need something that's small and portable. I need something that is, in the Milton Friedman sense, going to be delivered on a regular basis. So the stream of it is predictable. If all of a sudden, and this is what makes Bitcoin and the concepts of Bitcoin so attractive, is if it's mathematically determined that there's only going to be a certain amount, it's this Friedman notion of a steadily increasing monetary supply. If I have money, Todd money, and I just start issuing everybody Todd money, and then all of a sudden I print 1 billion scripts of Todd money, now all your money is diluted, right? I look like Venezuela. That's not a good look to have. So what's the currency? Herring. Little dried herring fillets. They come to the commissary in federal prisons. No one eats them. I mean, I like herring, but I'm strange that way. And so herring fillets are the currency of choice in federal prisons. So you have an entire financial system and a medium of exchange that operates in federal prisons because people need to cooperate for a variety of reasons. And this is the medium of exchange. And it's not government-provided currency. Lots of the transactions that I do today are not government-created currencies.
Right. So I have a slightly different thesis, which is for a while, the government actually did something to make its currency valuable or at least reliable in a way that private bank issued currencies was, and that was that they backed it by something. They backed it by gold reserves in a vault somewhere. And for the longest time, there was a specific amount of gold that was redeemable for $1, and so you knew that the scarcity of gold dug up out of the ground was the guarantee of value. And that persisted for a really long time. That, of course, ended, depending on who you count, either in the 30s or the 70s, right? And so it's not the case anymore. And yet, when I find myself in Washington talking to prominent financial regulators, chairs of the Senate Banking Committee, people like that, what they always say about crypto is they say, but unlike the dollar, it's not backed by anything. I keep asking you why these other people are saying that.
And
maybe I'm just looking for psychological counseling, but what's that about?
Yeah. So there was a philosopher who once took a question, I think it was Bertrand Russell, and the questioner said, this idea of the Earth going around the sun, it's crazy. The Earth is held up by a turtle. And Bertrand Russell said, well, what's holding up the turtle? And the question asker said, it's turtles all the way down. It's turtles all the way down. There is nothing, one more, standing behind the dollar other than the promise that the federal government will stand behind the dollar, or so. There's nothing.
By doing what? Stand behind the dollar by doing
nothing.
People say it's the full faith and credit of the government.
Nothing. That means nothing.
Just turtles.
That is turtles. Now, going back to the nirvana fallacy, the reason that, there was a good story in the Wall Street Journal the other day about Argentina and the mess that they're in. All of Argentina's financial system is backed by dollars. They have promised to print only amount of money that is backed by dollars. Dollars are gold to Argentinians. They believe there is some magic about the greenback and that will constrain their government from overprinting money. And so recently, the government of Argentina sent cargo planes to Washington and picked up gigantic pallets of dollars to bring them back to store in a bank like they sent those guys from Gold Rush up into the Yukon to get gold. Now, why is the United States in this very privileged position that we can have a government that is almost 3 times the size of the entire economy of Brazil, and yet we don't collect that amount of money in taxes, is because the rest of the world's even worse. So by virtue of being the country that is kind of got it the best in the world, we're able to just print money. The government just prints money. And the global facade that this means something is something that 5 billion other people believe. But it's just turtles.
Which is to say it's just trust,
Yes.
right? Trust is actually a psychological state of mind. That's it.
100% trust. And that's why it's literally on the money. In God we trust. It's a appeal from the sovereign to getting us to believe in the deity, which stands behind it or something like that. And the whole formality about the money and the Federal Reserve System. You know, if you, I don't know, 2,000 years from now, we'll look back on these kind of Federal Reserve board meeting minutes and people parsing the language or whatever, in the same way that we look at, you know, people rolling goat bones and stuff like, you know, these sort of mystical things that bring this kind of era of, you know, mysticism to it, because it's just turtles.
It's about the Greek temple.
Yes.
I come back to it. It's about the mythology.
Exactly.
So look, so for a while anyway, with the gold standard, the government did at least provide an underlying asset that created trust, which in a way that it doesn't anymore. Banks also played a role in the trust building, though, right? So the government was providing the gold reserves in Fort Knox or in the New York Fed. Banks were doing something important too, though. So you know, you were talking about when the King of England was going to go to war with the King of France. So in the olden days, you know, if the way I sometimes put it is, if Henry II was going to do some transaction with Genghis Khan, you know, or somebody unknown over a vast distance, because of the lack of trust, there was no ability to believe that repayments on that loan would be credited properly, or that, you know, you'd be treated fairly in some aspect of the transaction, which is why we had banks, right? And so when the Medici arose and when the Rothschild banks or the Warburg Bank arose, you know, hundreds of years ago, one of their roles was as ledger keeper. So it wasn't necessarily that they were giving value to the medium of exchange. They might have been doing that too. But it was also that they were maintaining ledgers of account. And I think one of the things that we think about a lot in crypto land is the idea that that too was just a pre-technological atavism, right? It's just something that just doesn't apply anymore, because now we have a technology that can keep the ledger of account for you. And so you don't need to pay somebody a fee to do that on an intermediary basis. Talk to me about the role of account keeping and ledger keeping as a trust builder, separate and apart from like whether there's gold backing these.
Yeah, I think you said it perfectly. That you know, if you trade securities, there's a bank in New York City, the Depository Trust Corporation, which has the literal stock certificates, and they're in a vault. Because when you own a share of Microsoft, you have a little piece of paper that says you own 1 share of Microsoft. These pieces of paper exist, and they're in a bank vault in Manhattan. And there's this very elaborate system for ensuring that when I sell a 1 share of Microsoft to Brian, that system is credited. And it takes 2 days, and there's this whole complicated process, and that's just crazy. It was necessary to make sure that when I traded my share of Microsoft, that everybody knew debit a share of Microsoft, credit a share of Microsoft. That elaborate system was necessary, and now it's completely unnecessary. I'll give an example that's outside the banking world. Hernando de Soto, who's a famous economist from Peru, wrote about what he calls the greatest invention in the Western world, and that it sits in the Daly Center in Chicago, and it's bureaucrats. It is the Land Record Office. And if you went in there on a given day, it doesn't look like this, where there's fancy waters and smart people and burritos. It's the most horrible place you could imagine, filled with bureaucrats who hate their jobs. And yet it is the cornerstone on which capitalism rests. And the reason why is because if I go in there, I can find out that 4941 South Kimbark Avenue is owned by me. And knowing that I own this piece of planet Earth, I can then borrow against that. I can engage in transactions which allow me to take an ownership interest in an asset and dramatically increase I can borrow against it, and then I can do stuff with that. I can lever that up. And that's the same way banks operate, right? The fractional reserve system, where they take my deposits. I know my deposits are there and they're safe. They lend those out. So my deposits aren't really in the bank for very long. So this property record office is hugely important. And one of the reasons why third world countries are not able to achieve the wealth that we are is because nobody knows who owns stuff. I've got like a hut in a favela somewhere in Rio de Janeiro, but I don't really have ownership. Can I borrow against it? Should I invest in it? Can I trust that no one else is going to take it? I don't have property rights. But do we need to pay those people in the property records office to sit there and have paper sheets where they go and they find out and pay people? If I want to buy a piece of land, I got to go down there and wait in line and take a little sticky and figure out who actually owned. No. Blockchain can do that like this. So we can deploy new technologies to make things vastly more efficient, but those people are going to resist. The lawyers and property insurance people, all who have a vested interest in the status quo of that system, are going to resist and say, oh, no, wait a second. We can't put this online. What if ... And those are we should doubt them because they have a huge interest in maintaining this very inefficient system. If we can make things more efficient, get the government out of that business, just like taking toll booth people out of toll booths and taxi commission people out of the taxis. If we can provide trust in a better way, the government can do other stuff. You know, whether you think the government should be bigger or smaller is kind of completely orthogonal to this question. Because if you think the government should be doing more to help healthcare or educate people or whatever you think they should be doing, where the government's wasting money on a bunch of areas where it's providing trust that could be better done by technology.
All right, so, Todd, so last thing before we open it up for questions is where does Bitcoin and crypto, by the way, I am wearing my Bitcoin cufflinks today. Where does Bitcoin and crypto fit into all of this? I mean, is this a real thing? Is this the front end of what's going to be the Uberization of the financial system? Are banks insurmountable as trust providers here because they're baked into a whole set of statutes and the statute books, and it's just too much to carry? What's your prediction?
I'm a short-term pessimist and a long-term optimist. I think you're right. The short-term, I mean, and I'm not as close to this world as you all are. My understanding of the fintech investment space is that big banks are gobbling up all of the innovations. And probably it makes them a little bit better, but probably they would like to slow down a lot of that innovation. I worked when I was a management consultant at McKinsey, we worked on a project with a company who could leapfrog Wi-Fi technology. This was in 2000, and they had something that was about the speed of what we have now with 5G. And Qualcomm bought it and buried it because Qualcomm had a whole system of chips that they were working on that was like, well, first we're going to do 2, and then we're going to do 3, and then we're going to do 4, and that was way better for them than going right to 5. And so that kind of thing I think is happening a lot with fintech space. Couple that with the government has a real strong interest in asserting its ability to have a monopoly on money, I think unwisely. And then just general people's fears about messing with the plumbing of the financial system. They think, oh, this is going to be like the financial crisis where the pipes are going to be clogged, or some brainiacs in San Francisco are going to be able to manipulate this and steal all the world's money like, you know, Gru from the Despicable Me movies or something. And so I think short term, there's going to be a lot of resistance, and the government as a regulator of a trust provider, competitors will push out back. I think technology wins in the end because I think, like Uber, there are going to be new technologies that are developed that unlock massive opportunities for people to just leapfrog in scale, exponentially. And those things you just can't put them back in. We've got regulatory tools. You know, I teach this stuff. All the regulatory tools that I teach current law students were written in the 1930s. We have regulatory tools written for the last century, and we've got 21st century issues. Artificial intelligence, CRISPR with genes, blockchain and Bitcoin. That genie will not stay in the bottle. So I think for the short term, I'm pessimistic, but I liked your idea that the real, like my urge to you all is deploy as fast as you can, as many places as you can, and push the technology, because when you see those kind of giant leaps, there's nothing that's going to put that back in the bottle.
Todd, this was really great. Thanks so much for doing it. Let's join me in giving Todd a round of applause.